Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking up the Buckeyes with Steve Helwagen from 247 Sports platform there for Ohio State football. That would be a Bucknuts, where he is a senior Big Ten writer. Steve, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. What's going on, Mark?
Well, I'm looking at this schedule for Ohio State. People love looking at schedules and trying to project what's going to happen and trying to figure out who we need to criticize for not scheduling tough enough, and then what teams are going to have a rough go at it. I looked at Stanford's schedule a couple of weeks ago with a Stanford writer, and the Cardinal have scheduled out of conference games, get this, Steve, against Notre Dame, of course, Central Florida, and Northwestern. That's their 3 out of conference games. No FCS, no real group of 5, obviously Central Florida, but Central Florida, Notre Dame, and Northwestern out of conference.
That's outstanding. They should be congratulated. Obviously, a lot of what will determine where they end up at the end of the season is dependent on how they'll do in the Pac-12. But I think that's outstanding. And I think that is a schedule that they should be rewarded for. If there's any way, if they're ever in contention for something at the end of the season, I think that is tremendous. But, one of the things that people get caught up on is who you played in your non-conference. And this is kind of the old SEC argument, is that the overall 12-game schedule that we play is superior to whatever anybody else plays, because our teams go out in the non-conference and beat people and are a higher quality team that we play in week 9, 10, 11 than what a lot of other teams play. So people give them a lot of criticism. I call it the Sun Belt and FCS games there the week before rivalry week, the week before Alabama, Auburn, and Florida State, and all those others. A lot of those schools are playing lesser opponents. But, you have to take it all into consideration, 1 through 12. It's not just a 1 week check off that, they had an easy game before their rivalry game. If you want to, their strength of schedule, this is just my recollection when we were doing all the comparisons with Oklahoma, Georgia, Ohio State, was all those SEC schools had better strength of schedule pretty much to a team than a lot of the teams they were being compared with. So you can hit them hard about that 1 week right before they play all the rivalry games. But the fact that Alabama played, Louisville, and Texas A&M played a good opponent, and LSU played and beat Miami. Auburn played and beat Washington. That in a sense, you have to look at the 12-game totality of it and not just pick it apart and say, they didn't play anybody in the non-conference. That doesn't matter. That kind of feeds into my argument as you look at who Ohio State is going to play in the non-conference in 2019.
So before we get to that, I'll wrap up the SEC situation, and you started to hit on it. The SEC went out this past year, and regardless of what you think of the conference, they went out and won the games against the Power 5. That's what happened.
Georgia over Georgia Tech, Florida over Florida State.
Absolutely.
Up and down the line, they dominated in those. Now, certainly there were some losses in there. Texas A&M played Clemson as an example. It came back to me, and Clemson held on and won at Texas A&M. But they get credit for playing a great opponent. I mean, at least in some small regard.
I give them a whole lot of credit because I seed the teams. This is what I do at the end of the season, and I have yet to do it this offseason, is I seed all the teams based on the standings in the Power 5, and then I go through all the results, and I weight the games based on the seedings. And so when you take a Texas A&M team which was a 6 or 7 seed in the SEC, and they played within 2 points of the national champion, I'm not going to discredit the SEC for that. They're going to take a slight hit for the loss just because it's a loss, but a much lesser loss than what Alabama faced, of course, in losing to Clemson as a 1 seed versus a 1 seed. And the SEC did not have bad losses. And actually they had the close, respectable losses, with Vandy going to Notre Dame, only losing by 1 score, and so forth. So they took care of business, and the SEC has to be given credit for that. Looking at Steve, the Ohio State schedule for coming up this year, and I know that there's a reason why this is the situation, but I just don't like the look of it because there are two things that I look at when I look at any Power Five schedule. It's number one, who do you play in the other division? Because obviously you play everyone in your division. There's a different format in each Power Five league as to who you play in the other division. And then my next question is, who do you play non-conference? And for Ohio State, despite the presence of a decent Cincinnati team within the group of five, there are no Power Five opponents in 3 non-conference games.
Yeah, I hear where you're coming from. I would agree with what you're saying. Last year, they played 2 Power Five conference teams with TCU and Oregon State, and won both games. And in the final analysis, they ended up 6th in the rankings. So it didn't help them last year to play 2. This coming year, they're going to play 0. And the reason for that was the scheduled game with TCU was a home and home contract. And basically, the game promoter at the Cowboys Stadium came up with the idea to enrich everybody several million more dollars to have one standalone game at AT&T Stadium. So they got rid of the home and home arrangement. Ohio State filled that date on its home schedule this year with Miami of Ohio, I believe. So they're playing Florida Atlantic, Cincinnati, which ended the season in the top 25 with 11 wins, and Miami of Ohio, which obviously is not should be a tough opponent for them. This is what I say to kind of counter the argument. You brought up the crossover games. I mean, you're going to play the 6 teams in your division every year: Penn State, Michigan State, Rutgers, Maryland, Indiana, Michigan State, whoever I missed in that. You're going to play those 6. That's your schedule every year. The Big Ten then has you play 3 of the 7 teams on the other side. Last year, that was Purdue, it was Minnesota, and it was Nebraska. This coming year, it's going to be Nebraska again, although on anyone's measure, this year's Nebraska team is going to be an upgrade over last year's Nebraska team. And then you're also going to play Wisconsin, which is a perennial top 25 opponent. Probably will be preseason top 25 with Taylor coming back. And so that's an upgrade over Purdue or Minnesota, and certainly Northwestern, which won the division and played Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game, is an upgrade over Purdue or Minnesota. So one or both of those teams, Wisconsin or Northwestern, could be ranked to start the season. Cincinnati possibly could be ranked, although typically they're not a preseason top 25 team, even if they would have I guess maybe the year after they went undefeated and lost to Florida, they were probably in there the next year. They got back to a major bowl the next year after that, I believe, for Kelly. But at any rate, people are going to point out, well, there's no TCU, there's no Oregon, there's no major conference, non-conference opponent. And I just come back to what I said earlier. Look at this 1 through 12. 1 through 12, it's about a wash compared to what they played last year. Major upgrades with the crossover games. Cincinnati is probably better than TCU on paper. So take that for whatever it's worth. Oregon State and Tulane, to me, that's akin to Miami of Ohio and Florida Atlantic, all terrible. So I know Tulane did make a bowl game, but whatever. So I'm a big believer in 1 through 12. Again, people who are only going to dig about a foot below the ground are going to say, you don't have a Power 5 opponent in there. Well, they had 2 last year and didn't do them a bit of good. So to me, that doesn't register at all as anything. The net number of ranked teams that they're going to play could be more this coming season, just because you're upgrading with Wisconsin and Northwestern in those crossover games. And both of those teams I have seen. Wisconsin certainly is a preseason top 25 in all the ones I did, and Northwestern was mentioned in about half of them. So they got to find a new quarterback, obviously, with Dorsey leaving. But, to me, it's a wash. And I'll take the 3 minutes and explain that to people who only want to dig skin deep and say, oh, no Power 5s, you're out of the running. Well, step back. They're going to play 9 Power Fives. So
We've got
that's as many or as a lot of teams play. So
we got Steve
Alabama's
Helwagen
probably going to play nine Power Fives. Auburn's probably
exactly.
going to play 9 Power Fives.
So we just don't go surface deep here at Mark Rogers TV.
No, we got to
college football.
take
So
the
we
crane
dig
and
in
dig it
there.
up.
That's right. We dig it up. So that's only one measurement, as you mentioned. The Oregon State game being a second Power Five. Well, let's put it into context. They were one of the 3 or 4 worst Power Five teams. And so then you could take out of the roughly 60 group of 5 teams, probably 25 to 30 of them were better than Oregon State, something in that range.
Cincinnati certainly is an upgrade over Oregon State.
Absolutely. So. Absolutely, they are. So it's only one measurement. I just throw it out as I would like.
Oh, they're going to hear it. Reese Davis, that's going to be pounded into his head. Discount Ohio State. No Power Fives. No Power Fives. No Power Fives. Boom, boom, boom. They're going to, from the first day that the college football playoff rankings come out until the day the field is selected. And they're going to be potentially 11-1, 12-0, whatever at the end, potentially, if Fields and everything clicks perfectly. They're going to be in the hunt, theoretically. You think they will be. But that's going to be the knock on them is they didn't play any Power Fives. They didn't play any Power Fives outside the conference. I'm saying don't fall for that because I bet the overall strength of schedule will be better. Whatever the Sagarin was for them in the 40s, I think this past year they'll probably be in the 30s this year.
So they need Cincinnati to come through for them.
Yes, yeah. With Central Florida, losing the quarterback, and although the guy who replaced him was pretty good, would help if Cincinnati could win that American for them, no doubt about, or at least make the championship game. That'd be huge.
And if Florida Atlantic turns out to be the team that they were 2 years ago, even though Ohio State, a team of their ilk that's competing for most likely for a college football playoff, regardless of how good Florida Atlantic's going to be, they're not going to be given.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you that they're off Broadway. The Conference USA is too far off Broadway. No one even looks at that. I mean, you're lucky if they look at 3 teams in the American as being quality in any given year. Houston, Central Florida, South Florida, early in the season last year, Memphis at some point. But, nobody – I mean, Cincinnati played Central Florida in a primetime game. They did get a little bit of run for that, but no one really gave them much credit, on the whole. They played a great bowl game with Virginia Tech and won. So I don't know, whatever that's worth.
You brought up the non-division games. So what really bothers me about this, and I'll go to the SEC and the ACC first. So they have what is a cross-division rivalry, which in some matters makes sense. Alabama plays Tennessee. That makes sense. They have a long-standing rivalry. Auburn and Georgia, they've got the South's oldest rivalry, etc. Some of them make sense. Mississippi State playing Kentucky every year makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't need to be played. I don't know why they just don't keep the rivals, the 2 or 3 rivals in place that have to be played, and then the other ones can rotate and just join the other second rotated game. The ACC does the same thing. They've got some rivalries that make sense cross-division. Other ones don't. They should get rid of them. I would like to see a more balanced schedule. So, for example, last year Nebraska had to play Ohio State, Michigan, and Michigan State. That was their 3-game allotment from the East Division. It wasn't fair. They played 3 teams that had like an 800 winning percentage from the season before, as opposed to somebody else who played like 3 teams that went 300 winning percentage. I would like to see a more balanced schedule based on last year's standings. Ohio State has a difficult draw, as you mentioned, this year, what appeared to be a difficult draw with games at Nebraska, at Northwestern, a game against Wisconsin at home.
I think you raise a good point. I think that it's hard to serve all masters, I think, in this scheduling thing. And I can't explain why the Big Ten does this, but they schedule these games 4 and 5 years out, whereas the ACC, I think, just did theirs here. Maybe they knew the opponents, but they set the dates here just recently, whereas the Big Ten goes date certain like 4 years out on these things. And I don't know quite why that is, why you can't change whatever your plans are in the same calendar year, but that's just the way that it works out right now. So I would probably agree with you to a point. I think when you have a program that has been at Nebraska, I mean, they're one of the top 4 or 5 winningest programs in the history of the sport. One of the purposes for them joining the Big Ten and to give value to the television partners was to create matchups between those 4 and 5 schools that are on that wins list, which is Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, Nebraska. The TV partners want to see those matchups because they do well historically in the ratings. You're trying to give value to your TV partners. So I was Ohio State had gone 4 years or so without playing Nebraska. And then when they redid the schedule, they were supposed to play them 3 or 4 times in the next 5 or 6 years. The same thing with Wisconsin. It was hit or miss. And they had a great rivalry going with Wisconsin from when they were briefly together in the leaders division, I believe. They were playing every year then, and they went to geography. After that, now everybody wants geography scrapped. Again, you can't serve all masters, and you can't make everybody happy because you stick around 4 years. It's like SEC. I mean, we're old enough to remember when Florida, Tennessee, and Georgia dominated the earth that they walked on, and Alabama and LSU and Auburn were terrible. At the same time, it was East, here, and West, holding up everything here. Well, in the last 10 years, it's flipped the other direction, and it runs in cycles. And Ohio State's in a very good cycle right now. Michigan's been marginally better than they've been. Penn State won the Big Ten. Michigan State's won a couple Big Tens. So you add it all up. I mean, I understand what you're saying. What they have said in the Big Ten, if I'm not mistaken, is in a 5-year period, if a player plays a 5-year career, red shirt in 4 years, they will have played every team, all other 13 teams in the Big Ten at least one time. So they have procedures in place to rotate it where everybody sees everybody. I think there was something I read in the SEC where, maybe Georgia and Alabama play once every 20 years or something stupid like that. And, that's
once every 6.
Yeah, whatever it may be. But there was a tremendous anomaly. Somebody was in the teens where they hadn't played. Now, granted, in this last 20 years, it's been tremendous upheaval because there's been, you add Missouri, you add Texas A&M, you reconstrict, configure, things change. It's possible for a matchup to slip through the cracks just because of just when we thought we had it set, we added 2 more teams and we had to blow it up. So it was much easier, obviously, to play every team in a 4-year period when there were only 12 teams in the league. Now that there's 14, it takes, some fancy footwork sometimes with the computer to build it in there to say, hey, we want everybody to play everybody at least once in a 5-year period. And, we get what we get. But I'm a big believer, the Big Ten has one protected crossover, and that's Purdue and Indiana are in separate divisions. And because they're in the same state, they make sure that they play every year at the end. The rest of it is up to the whim of the computer. It's been programmed, I think, to spit out a lot of Ohio State, Nebraska, and Ohio State, Wisconsin matchups. But, it's crazy. We played Wisconsin and Illinois and Purdue and Northwestern and Minnesota every other year or every year, or, Illinois in particular. They played them every year from 1912 until about 2006, continuously. And that went by the wayside. And you played those teams every year, every other year for 100 years. And now you see them sporadically, and yet you're playing Maryland and Rutgers on an annual basis. And I think for a lot of people, new isn't necessarily better. So
it's not when it comes to those 2 schools having to play Ohio State every year, but you're in the division, and there are always going to be bad teams in every league anywhere, because it's just the nature of competitive sports. If you have really good teams, you're going to have really bad teams, because everybody plays and everybody wins the game and loses the game. So the entire conference goes 500, regardless of how good the conference is or how bad the conference is. When you add up all the records, they equal 500, because everybody has to win the game and lose the game. Steve, you know as well as anyone that 2002 team famously won 13 consecutive games without a bye week.
Yes, and Ohio State's going to have 2 bye weeks this year, which is
Yes, I'm looking
interesting.
at this, and that's why that came to mind.
It's a unique calendar, I think, with the way that Labor Day falls and Thanksgiving kind of falls late in November. This kind of gives rise to what a lot of people think, down the line, although when the directors for the playoff got together around the time of the championship game, they came out of the meeting and said there is no real push from the presidents or the commissioners to push it to 4 teams. It's still 2 and will be 2 for the foreseeable future. This schedule this year with an extra bye week kind of gives you a thought that, there is time on this calendar, even if we started the season August 25th, as early as August 25th some years. Maybe play those games in Canada or something where it's not quite as, even in Columbus on August 25th, it's going to be 85 degrees and 90% humidity, just in 105 degrees on the field. But maybe there's a way to squeeze in a 12-game season, a conference championship, and even a layer of the playoffs before the through the first week of December. So the championship game this year, the conference championships, will be played as late as ever on December the 7th. So I don't know. I guess those are kind of built in the first Saturday of December, and you work back, I suppose. But this year, 2 bye weeks, and as you point out, we've had years in the past where you didn't have anything like that at all on the schedule. So, it's a bear. It really is for these kids, and this is how things like losing for Ohio State, losing at Iowa, losing at Purdue happen, because you play a tough opponent and then have to go on the road the next week, and sometimes you're not fully prepared for that next game. It'll jump up and bite you. So we've seen that, at least with Ohio State. I think there's a lot of people pointing at Ohio State's game this coming year, and Nebraska, a team that gave Ohio State a very tough game in Columbus as a kind of a trap type game. But this year's team will have no excuses. They'll be well rested as they get into the meaty part of the schedule.
Steve, 85 degrees in August is sounding pretty good to myself and a whole lot of people right now.
Yeah, I woke up this morning in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We were there for the basketball last night. When we got up, it was -8 on the thermometer, and the wind chill was -33. And I walked out to try and start the car, and I was saying a little prayer, and I put the key in, and it went, and then it turned over, thank God. But it didn't want to. It did not want to. And my buddy was saying, this car is saying, you cannot be serious. But it got us back to Ohio safe and sound, and I got the oil changed and had the antifreeze checked before I left. So we were all good. So maintain proper maintenance on your car. You're going to be out in this weather. Pack a blanket and make sure the cell phone battery is charged, because it is deadly out there. It really is.
It really is. So we're getting our driving tips and our car maintenance tips from Steve as well this week.
Well, that trip to Michigan and back was an eye opener. Trust me. And I think the conditions there were basically the same as what we had here in Central Ohio. Not maybe a degree or 2 or whatever colder, but we don't have cold like this typically. It usually never gets much below 10 degrees in the course of normal. We might have some single-digit days here and there, but below 0 is pretty rare here. So and the wind to be blowing like it is too. We were driving back from Michigan, and the car was, I'm fighting to keep the car on the road with the wind whipping across the plains like that. So yeah, there's severe conditions. There's no doubt about it.
Now, Steve, that reminds me of a story I was telling just a couple days ago when I was running through some Super Bowl memories. When I first became an NFL fan, my dad, bless his heart, rest in peace, drove me to the Silver Dome because I was a big Fran Tarkenton fan, and it was his last season, and it was his second to last regular season game he ever played. And my dad drove us in December. Myself and my dad drove to the Silver Dome, and he had to drive back to Akron, Ohio, in a blizzard after the Minnesota Vikings lost 45-14, and I think Fran Tarkenton probably threw like 4 interceptions in the game. But I got to see the one of the final games for Fran Tarkenton, and that was my memory there, talking about my favorite football teams growing up. So, yeah, because without the buys, this would be a brutal stretch of Nebraska, Michigan State, Northwestern, and Wisconsin. But you got the 2 buys in there to break up those 4 critical games for Ohio State. Got Steve Helwagen on the line from Bucknuts. Steve, one other thing comes to mind in looking at the schedule, and that's Penn State right before Michigan. Now, we've typically seen Ohio State play lesser teams in the Big Ten before playing Michigan, although there was a couple of years there they had to take on Michigan State before Michigan. And this time around, it's Penn State, then going to Ann Arbor.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting scheduling when you look at it. I don't know what to necessarily make of it and why that's happened. In recent years, Penn State has traditionally been played the last weekend of September, Ohio State and Penn State, and it's usually been a night game. The Big Ten in general, after about the 8th or 10th of November, doesn't play any more night games. So the Penn State game will not be a night game. The week before Ohio State goes to Michigan, they'll play Penn State at home in their final home game, and it will not be a night game. So interesting scheduling. Kind of gets back to what we were talking about, to have to get up for one big game and then play another big game the following week. But that's what the schedule says, and that's what the team will have to do if they want to go the distance next year and win the East. I think it's you're going to probably have to win both those games at the end of the year in an 8-day period. And Penn State coming to Ohio State, they're going to have a new quarterback. McSorley's done. Michigan obviously is dying to beat Ohio State, and Shea Patterson, he'll be back, but they've lost a lot of key guys off that team with Higdon and Bush and Rashawn Gary and some of the other guys. So they're going to be in kind of a rebuild mode up there as well. So Donovan Peoples-Jones is back. I know that name. He's borderline freak right now at the wide receiver position and really primed to have a big year. So Ohio State's going to have to do a good job, with its retooled defense, I guess, or new assistants on defense. But that is about as tough as it gets, because even when they had to play Michigan State the week before, a couple, 2-3 years ago, Michigan State was in a down year. They were only 4-8, I think, that season. And yet, it was a close game up at East Lansing. But Ohio State got through it and then beat Michigan, obviously, the following week. But it wasn't easy. Certainly, I think that was the 2016 year where they came back home and won in double overtime. So, it's a tough order to have to play those two teams, your two biggest rivals right now in the division, back-to-back weeks. But it is what it is. And, for whatever reason, that's just the way the computer spit out the schedule this year.
All right, folks, you might be watching us here on YouTube. You may be watching once Steve posts this video to Bucknuts. So obviously, if you're watching us on YouTube and you want extensive, really in-depth Ohio State football coverage, then you join Steve and the rest of the staff there with football and the basketball team as well on bucknuts.com, the 247 sports platform for Ohio State athletics. And if you happen to catch us here, as Steve has so graciously posted these videos to Bucknuts, and you love college football, then you join me at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, and see all these teams right here and more. We bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry to talk college football on a daily basis. Steve, anything else out of you?
No, I think that's about it. I'm getting ready. You and I were talking scheduling. I'm getting ready to post a thing probably tomorrow about Ohio State's schedule for 2019 and some of the hiccups and different things that will be in there. As you mentioned, 2 bye weeks. better crossover games. Rare, obviously, that they don't play a major conference opponent in the preseason. Cincinnati with Luke Fickell as their coach, they won 11 games, and he would love nothing better than to come in and keep the momentum going and beat his alma mater, certainly at Ohio Stadium. And, one thing I will say that is a little bit of an anomaly next year is the playoff scheduling. The semifinals, for anybody who's looked ahead, are going to be in Atlanta and Phoenix on December the 28th. I'm not sure if that's a Friday or a Saturday, but it's earlier than it's been. It's usually been the 29th here. Last year or two, it's been moved up a day. And then they're not going to play the championship game until, I believe, the 12th or 13th. So it'll be almost a better than 2-week layoff until you play the championship game. So, and I look ahead at these things all the time because I'm always thinking about logistics and coverage and how are we going to, handle this months down the line. And I know for us, getting to these, scrambling to get to these, to enjoy a Christmas holiday and yet get to these venues where they're going to have media events on the morning of the 26th, is going to be, it'd be a good problem to have, I guess, if that's what it comes down to. But we're going to be moving, if the teams the week of are involved in it, we're going to be moving heaven and earth to get there and scramble to get there and to cover those games. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I wish that those semifinals, they tried them on the 31st and it didn't work for whatever reason. They're basically blacked out on Sundays and even Saturdays in some cases because of NFL. They don't want to go up against the NFL and cannibalize their ratings. So they're doing the best that they can on an annual basis to slot these games. But, this is kind of the offshoot of it, that there's no rhyme or reason for when these games are scheduled. So I know ESPN came out and said that the ratings were pretty good, I think, for the playoffs this year, despite the fact that you had a blowout in one of the semifinal games. So I guess this format's what we're stuck with for the foreseeable future.
So I'm not quite understanding. I'm looking up I just pulled up the calendar, Steve, and we've got, as you mentioned, the 27th or the 28th that would be the Friday and Saturday of December. And then they would typically let the next week go and then come back and play the next Monday, which is the 6th, because they played the 7th this past year. So you're saying that they're waiting another week?
Yes, sir. January 13th is what
Wow.
it'll be. Yeah. The championship game this coming year, I want to say, is in New Orleans, I think. So that's nice that it'll be in a traditional college football city and stadium that's hosted so many big games over the years. But you maybe won't have the apathy that we saw out in California for that game out there. But at any rate, for whatever reason, that's what they've come up with this year. I'm not quite sure why.
So there's going to be a 16-day layoff between the college football playoff semifinals and the national championship game, which would normally, if they back it up a week to where it's always been, it would be a 9-day layoff. And that's typically what it's been. The last thing I'll mention, Steve, before I let you go, is I'm sure a number of people that will be watching this would smirk at your comment about Luke Fickell wanting to come into Ohio Stadium and win that game. But as we referenced 2002's national championship season, that obviously was a barn burner of a game that came down to I believe a Chris Gamble interception in the end zone to hold off the Bearcats to remain undefeated. And that Ohio State team barely beat Cincinnati, a Bearcats team that wasn't anywhere near as good as the team that they hit the field with this past season in 2018.
Yeah, they played that game in 2002 down at Paul Brown Stadium. They'd come up with a way to do a contract, which is a creative contract, which is something that I think Central Florida is going to have to accept with the Floridas and whatever, where there were, I want to say, as many as 3 or 4 home games for Ohio State in the contract with Cincinnati, and the one game at Cincinnati, which they moved to the Bengals Stadium, Paul Brown Stadium. It was a great event. It was a great thing to cover. And as I plug in my computer. It was a tremendous. I didn't want to run out of power there. It was a tremendous event, a great thing for college football. You know, John Cooper used to say that if you play 20 Mid-American teams, one of them at some point, not that Cincinnati's Mid-American team, is going to jump up and beat you. And along the time he said that, back in the mid-'90s, Peyton Manning and the Vols went down to Memphis and got beat at Memphis by the Tigers. So, you know, you put yourself in these games and these situations enough, somebody is going to catch a tiger by the tail and pull that victory off. I don't want to say it's like Maryland, Baltimore County beating a top seed Virginia in the NCAA tournament, but you know, crazy things do happen. If there's a fumble or a bad interception or somebody gets hit and it's a defensive touchdown or whatever, some crazy things can happen from time to time. We've seen it. So, you know, I'm old enough to remember that I think it was Air Force beat Ohio State in the Liberty Bowl one time.
That's right.
Robert Smith was the running back for the Buckeyes. So back around 1989 or 90. So,
Yeah.
you know, goofy, crazy things do happen from time to time. Ohio State hasn't lost. I'd have to look up the last time they lost to a non Power 5 opponent, but that may be it. I don't know, but there may be one other one somewhere in the vast history. I'd have to think about it.
I really don't think so. I think that would be the one. And you well remember that that Ohio State team came that close to going to the Rose Bowl. They got stopped on a 4th and inches, Greg Fry against Michigan, and they lose in a last-second field goal. Then they turn around and get subjected to a cold Memphis night in late December against Air Force as a 17-point favorite, and they fall to the Falcons.
Yeah, crazy. Some crazy things will happen from time to time. And, you know, what can I say? I mean, we've seen teams that were several touchdown favorites that don't win the game. And, you know, these things happen from time to time. But what can you do? It's just the nature of the game.
And despite the greatness of Jim Tressel's run at Ohio State, as you well know, and can remember better than I can, he had a close call against Marshall. He had a close call against San Diego State. And I believe a Bowling Green team. I know that John Cooper.
24-17, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know they had a close call against Bowling Green about a decade earlier with John Cooper on the sideline in like 92.
Yeah. The Bowling Green was in 03 before Urban Meyer, maybe after Urban Meyer left, I believe. Maybe he was there in 1 and 2, and then at Utah in 3 and 4, and then Florida in 5. So, yeah, it was in 3. Greg Brandon had taken over. It was 24-17. Ohio State won. In 2004, they played Marshall. It was 24-21, and Mike Nugent, who went on to had, you know, he's still kind of banging around a little bit in the NFL after 12 or 13 years. He had a 55-yard field goal, and it looked like a 2-iron shot that didn't get much above the crossbar, but he singed it right into the back of the net. I mean, it was crazy. And they won the game on the last play, 24-21. I'm trying to think, you know, some of those other close calls, as you mentioned, have, well, the San Diego State game was 2003. They won like 16-13, and they didn't have an offensive touchdown in that game, which is one of at least 3 or 4 games in the Tressel period that they won a game without benefit of an offensive touchdown. That was a staple of the Jim Tressel era at Ohio State. That also happened against Penn State in 2002. Chris Gamble had an interception return. May have happened against Iowa in 2003. Like 16-13, something like that. So, yeah, those were crazy times when, you know, you didn't have a quarterback that would go out and throw for 300 yards, let alone what we saw this year with a guy who was flirting with 400 and 500 yards every game, with the points just flowing behind that. It hasn't always been like that.
Nice discussion with Steve Helwagen from Bucknuts. You can join him as the senior Big Ten writer for 247 Sports. All right, Steve, we could talk memory lane forever, and we'll have plenty of time to do that throughout the off-season.
The long off-season, yes.
All right, Steve, you stay warm, and hopefully that car keeps doing the job for you.
This is Ohio weather. It's going to be 14 is the high tomorrow, then 30 on Friday, 40 on Saturday, and then the mid 50s, believe it or not, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday of next week. It'll be warm enough to go out and play golf. Whereas right now, it's not even warm enough to walk outside. So,
Yeah, and it's
yeah,
gonna
the
feel
weather
like
here,
80.
the weather here changes on a dime. So,
We appreciate
crazy.
it, Steve.
All right, take care.